So as far as I see, we're having more than 100 attendees, and we are pleased to meet you all today. Joining our emergency briefing. We're meeting here today to better understand the significant health and scientific dimensions of the possible crisis. And I'd like to introduce myself. Today I'm going to be the moderator of the event. My name is Olga Mironova. I'm cardiologist and associate professor of the chair of faculty therapy number 1 at Sechenov University, Moscow, Russia. My grandfather, Eugene Chazov, deceased last November, was one of the founders of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, also called IPPNW. So for the ones who are not that familiar, for the abbreviations IPPNW. And so I think I'm the closest to the border of the potential war that we are discussing today. And we're not covering any political questions today, and we're only discussing the health and scientific consequences of the possible threat. As you see, we are working today in the Zoom webinar mode, so the chat is disabled, so you can ask the questions in the Q&A section. You can find it below. And please, when you're asking the question, could you please specify the specific presenter that your question is addressed to? And so now I'm glad to introduce the first speaker, Barry Levy, who is with Tufts Medical School in Boston, and who has written and spoken extensively on the health impact of war for many years. His new book on the subject is From Horror to Hope. And today, Barry is covering the topic of health impacts of conventional war. So Barry, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olga. Today, I'm going to briefly discuss 3 topics. First, death and illness among non-combatant civilians during war. Second, what might be the health impacts of war in Ukraine. And third, how the health impacts of war can be prevented or at least reduced. But first, close your eyes. I want you to imagine what it would be like to be living in a war zone. And for those of you who have lived in a war zone, I want you to recall what it was like. Keep your eyes closed. What do you see? What do you hear? What are you worrying about? How will you react when family members are attacked or injured? What will you do when the food runs out or the water stops flowing? How will you get the medicine you need? How will you get help when your phone doesn't work and the internet is down? Where will you go when your home is destroyed? How will you and your family survive? You can open your eyes now. This imaging exercise is over, but for many people today, this is not an exercise. It is the reality of living in a war zone. During war, civilians are often killed directly, sometimes accidentally, by the indiscriminate use of weapons. You could say they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and hit by bombs or bullets or other explosives. But increasingly, civilians are targeted, attacked on purpose as part of a strategy of war. Men are taken from their homes in the middle of the night, never to return. Women are raped and often killed. Even children are sometimes targeted and killed as a strategy of war. However, most deaths during war are not caused by direct attacks, but indirectly. Many of these indirect attacks are caused by damage to infrastructure. Farms and the food supply system are damaged. People become malnourished and die. Water treatment plants are bombed and people develop cholera or other diarrheal diseases. Hospitals and healthcare workers are attacked. Public health agencies are not able to function, and people are unable to receive clinical care or public health services. And by the way, Leonard Rubinstein's new book, Perilous Medicine, addresses attacks on healthcare and what needs to be done. Other damage during war affects power generation, communication networks, and transportation systems. all of which indirectly cause or worsen disease and increase the risk of death. Besides damage to infrastructure, population displacement is the other major cause of indirect deaths during war. People can be displaced within their own country to become internally displaced persons, or as refugees to other countries. Internally displaced persons are generally worse off because they have inadequate food, water, healthcare, and security, and therefore are at increased risk of disease and death. And if war continues, people may be displaced for long periods of time, even decades. Indirect deaths far outnumber direct deaths during war. Since 1990, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden has recorded an average of about 50,000 direct deaths per year in state-based armed conflicts. In a totally separate analysis for the same period of time, Mohammed Jawad and colleagues estimated that on average about a million indirect deaths due to war occurred among civilians per year, 20 times more indirect deaths than direct deaths. This slide graphically illustrates this difference. Even if the estimate of indirect deaths is far too high or the number of direct deaths recorded far too low, the fact remains that indirect deaths far outnumber direct deaths during most wars. On the next 5 slides, I will list and briefly discuss the 5 main categories of the health impacts of war, with increased occurrence during war and greater severity because of reduced access and reduced availability of healthcare. First, malnutrition, with young children and pregnant women being at greatest risk. Second, communicable diseases, including diarrheal diseases such as cholera, acute respiratory infections such as COVID-19, and other diseases such as measles and tuberculosis. Third, mental disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, depression, suicide. Fourth, adverse effects on reproductive health, including higher rates of maternal mortality and infants born with low birth weight and infant mortality. And these adverse effects are mainly due to the lack of adequate prenatal care and the lack of trained birth attendants being available during labor and delivery. And certainly the lack of neonatal intensive care units and people to care for children infants at greatest risk. And the 5th category is non-communicable diseases with both greater occurrence and more exacerbations, heart disease and stroke, chronic lung disorders, cancer, diabetes, and so forth. But while everyone is at risk, some populations, though, are especially vulnerable. Women, children, displaced people, older people, people with chronic diseases or disabilities, indigenous peoples, and other ethnic and religious minorities. I have focused so far on non-combatant civilians, but keep in mind many combatants in war are actually civilians who have been forced, coerced, or strongly enticed into military service and might otherwise not choose to fire weapons. They too are at high risk of death, disease, and disability, especially from injuries, communicable diseases, and mental disorders. What will be the magnitude of the health impacts of war in Ukraine? No one knows. But we can ask, what have we learned from previous wars in which a superpower has invaded a middle-income country? For example, what happened when the United States invaded Iraq about 20 years ago? The adverse consequences, the health consequences of the Iraq war, which lasted 10 years, have been extensively studied and reported. Large numbers of civilian deaths, widespread damage to infrastructure, increased child malnutrition, widespread mental disorders, displacement of millions of people, many violations of human rights, and substantial environmental damage. Ukraine today is similar in some ways to Iraq in 2003 and different in other ways. Ukraine, about the size of Texas, has 42 million people today. Iraq, about the size of California, back in 2003 had 26 million, but was more densely populated than Ukraine today. Life expectancy, as you can see, about the same, 72 and 69 years of life expectancy at birth. Infant mortality rate, however, is much, much lower in Ukraine, reflecting perhaps an overall better health status of the population than so 7 per 1,000 live births now versus 34 per 1,000 live births in Iraq back in 2003. But the most important thing I want you to take away from this table is the bottom line here. The percentage of the population age 65 and older, 17% in Ukraine versus just over 3% in Iraq. In other words, 5 times higher in Ukraine than in Iraq. Because of the much older population in Ukraine, there are higher rates of chronic disease and disability, more dependency on ongoing medical care, less mobility, and increased vulnerability to COVID-19. Therefore, the death rate in a protracted war in Ukraine could be even higher, maybe much higher than the death rate in the war in Iraq. War and its health impacts can be prevented or at least reduced. And here are the 4 levels of prevention that can be applied. Primordial prevention addresses the root causes of war. Primary prevention addresses precipitating causes of war and works to resolve disputes nonviolently. Secondary prevention aims to end war and reduce its impacts. Tertiary prevention rehabilitates and restores health of individuals and communities after war has ended. Once war breaks out in Ukraine, and it may be within the next 24 hours, focus will need to be on secondary prevention, protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including healthcare, providing humanitarian assistance, and working to end the war as soon as possible. So in summary, most impacts of most wars result from indirect causes, damage to civilian infrastructure and population displacement cause much death and illness. Vulnerable groups are especially high risk, and once war has begun, civilians and infrastructure must be protected, humanitarian assistance provided, and efforts directed to ending war immediately.
Thank you so much, Barry, for your speech and for such an interesting comparison of Ukraine situation and the Iraqi one. And as far as I see, we don't have any questions to you for the moment in the Q&A section. So please feel free to ask your questions and specify to which of the presenters you're addressing to. And now I'm so glad to present Linda Pence-Gunther, who founded Beyond Nuclear in 2007 and serves as its international specialist as well as its media and development director. And prior to her work in anti-nuclear advocacy, she's been a journalist for 20 years in print as well and broadcast.
Thank you, Olga.
Papers. So please, Linda, Linda is covering today the question of damage to nuclear power reactors.
Thanks, Olga, and thanks to IPPNW for inviting me, and to all of you attending today. Greetings from the nuclear-free city of Tacoma Park, Maryland. First slide, please. So I'm going to discuss the 6 possible disaster scenarios, and I'm just gonna fix something here. Sorry, I need to just exit the full screen here. Yeah. So I'm going to discuss the 6 possible disaster scenarios and the ensuing humanitarian consequences should any of Ukraine's 15 operating reactors become embroiled in a war. And I'll also look at the risks posed by Chernobyl and the exclusion zone. My contact information, in case you want to follow up with me, is also on this slide. And you can remove the slide now, thanks. But first, I want to make a general observation. The presence of 15 reactors in Ukraine, or any nuclear reactors anywhere, automatically adds to the medical risks for the surrounding population should something else major happen. And that something else need not be a war. We are already seeing the ravages of the climate crisis and how this can knock out essential power supplies. Nuclear power plants are already vulnerable. They are more so if caught up in a war that could cause the grid to go down. So let's first see where Ukraine's reactors are. Next slide, please. There are 15 reactors in Ukraine grouped at 4 sites. So we want to go to that slide, that's it. So 15 reactors here, you can see in Ukraine, grouped at 4 sites. They are Russian VVER reactors of 1,000 megawatts each. And there's the closed Chernobyl nuclear plant in the north, which I'll talk about at the end of my presentation. So under my disaster scenario number 1, none of the reactors are directly in the war zone, but the war takes out the electric grid, whether by accident or deliberate sabotage, including even through a cyber attack. If the grid goes down, the nuclear power plant operators will try to shut the reactors down. But if they lose on-site power as well, should that backup power fail, as it did at Fukushima, for example, things can get far more dire, and I'll describe that under scenarios 3 and 4. So just loss of power at reactors, even far from the battle zone, could be a serious outcome of a war in Ukraine. Looking at Ukraine's reactors, are any likely to be within the battle zone? Rivne and Malnytskaya in the far west are probably out of harm's way. South Ukraine, which is the only one I can pronounce correctly, is also less likely to come under direct attack. So of most concern, given its size and location, is Zaporozhye. It's the largest nuclear power station in Europe with a net capacity of 5,700 megawatts. You can remove the slide now, thanks. The Zaporozhye reactors were already vulnerable during the Crimea invasion in 2014, when a far-right Ukrainian group tried to gain entry. They are about 200 kilometers from the Donbas conflict zone. Under disaster scenario number 2, the plant is embroiled in the war zone, but not attacked or hit. Under these circumstances, the nuclear power plant workers may fear for their lives and the lives of their families. They would want to and should evacuate with their loved ones. But what happens if they do? The answer is they can't, or not all of them. Nuclear power plants, even under normal circumstances, are never walk away safe. Some workers would have to stay behind. If the nuclear workforce evacuates, you set in motion a cascade of meltdowns at that site, whether or not it is directly attacked, which brings us to disaster scenario number 3. What if one or more of these reactors takes an accidental hit from a bomb or missile, or even just artillery fire? Then we could be talking about another Chernobyl, or actually multiple Chernobyls. A hit could destroy the reactor immediately. That's really the worst of all possible outcomes. But even if the reactor is severely damaged or disabled, then you start to lose coolant and the reactor heats up, the fuel rods are exposed, and explosive gases are created. One spark and you could see an explosion, as we did at 3 of the Fukushima reactors. Some of the workforce may be injured or killed or struggling to shut down the remaining reactors. And added to that, if the spent fuel pools boil and evaporate, exposing the rods, these could catch fire. And a fuel pool fire is even worse than the reactor exploding, because spent fuel pools contain a far hotter radioactive infantry than the reactor itself. Those radioactive releases would be dispersed across thousands of miles. We've already had a glimpse of what that would look like for human health after Chernobyl. Next slide, please. So here we can see the Plume Pathway for just radioactive cesium-137 resulting from the 1986 Chernobyl explosion. The worst affected areas were Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, but the plume extended across all of Europe. And you can see that not all the hotspots are concentrated closest to Chernobyl either. Those are the darker red areas. But this time it would be worse. Ukraine's 15 reactors are all much older than Chernobyl Unit 4 was in 1986. They have bigger radioactive inventories, and they are all multiple reactor sites. People all across Europe would be affected. Remove the slide, please. My 4th disaster scenario is a deliberate attack. Now we'll take the slides down for a minute, thanks, and I'll come back to that in a minute. My 4th disaster scenario is a deliberate attack on the reactors, an act of sabotage to disable them, or even a cyber attack. We know nuclear sites are vulnerable to cyber attack. We've seen it before with the 2010 Stuxnet cyber attack on 15 of Iran's nuclear facilities, including the Natanz uranium enrichment plant. But would Russia really use reactors as a weapon of war? allowing them to deliberately melt down and potentially contaminate wide portions of Europe. This would seem like a scaled down exercise in mutually assured destruction, given prevailing winds would likely blow much of the radiation across Russia and Belarus. A deliberate attack on a nuclear plant would have much the same outcome as an accidental one. It would release a massive plume of radioactivity and would be a medical and humanitarian disaster of monumental and likely completely unmanageable proportions. What would that mean for human health? We should have a guide from the example of Chernobyl, but there was, I would say, a scandalous and even heartless international effort by agencies like the IAEA with vested interests in minimizing the disaster to do just that. So we must look to independent sources to get a truer sense of the numbers. And here we must remind ourselves that with Chernobyl, we are talking about just one relatively new reactor, not the multiple ones now in Ukraine containing far more radioactivity. I would say that three of the best sources on the real health impacts are IPPNW Germany's 20 years after Chernobyl report, Ian Fairley's Torch report, and Kate Brown's book, Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future. And then you just take their numbers and imagine an orders of magnitude worse situation if, let's say, one or more of the Zaporozhye reactors are hit, whether accidentally or deliberately, and melt down. And that's not where it ends. Looking at a specific sample of Chernobyl victims, Dr. Vladimir Vertelecki, a physician and geneticist who conducted post-Chernobyl research in Polisia, Ukraine, found birth defects and other health disturbances among not only those who were adults at the time of the Chernobyl disaster, but their children who were in utero at the time, and most disturbingly, their later offspring. So if reactors are breached during a war in Ukraine, that war, in a medical sense, will never be over. But what about the Chernobyl exclusion zone? Could it and the nuclear site itself get caught up in a war? This is scenario number 5. Russian troops could choose to cross into Ukraine from Belarus, the shortest route to Kyiv, taking them through the Chernobyl zone. But it is marshy and difficult terrain in addition to being radioactive, so certainly not the ideal entry point. The destroyed Chernobyl Unit 4, along with 200 metric tons of uranium, plutonium, liquid fuel, and irradiated dust, are encased in a sarcophagus completed in 2019. But that sarcophagus, which is only supposed to last for 100 years, could collapse under the vibrations of explosions in a war zone. That would loft radioactive dust into the atmosphere, causing yet another major health crisis. And there is one more huge threat to this area, as well as to any war zone involving nuclear plants, and that is fire. Disaster scenario number 6. We've already seen literally hundreds of fires in the Chernobyl zone. Sadly, many started deliberately. Under ever more extreme climate conditions, wildfires will get larger and more frequent. In 2020, a forest fire that broke out within the Chernobyl zone threatened to reach the plant site. Here are a couple of views of what that looks like, and you can show that firefighter slide now. So that's the Chernobyl Fire Department, who struggled a long time to contain that fire. And next slide, please. And here is an aerial view of that same vast fire. Forest fires reloft and redistribute radiation trapped in the soil. The 2020 fire increased radiation levels to 16 times higher than they had been previously. War clearly raises the risk of fires. And the Chernobyl zone is a tinderbox. Dr. Tim Mousseau and his team discovered that dead wood and leaf litter on the forest floors is not decaying properly, likely because the microbes and other organisms that drive the process of decay are reduced or gone due to their own prolonged exposure to radiation. You can remove the slide now, thanks. Equally, wildfires triggered by war close to any of Ukraine's operating reactors could have dire consequences. Even under just normal reactor operating circumstances, fire is considered the bulk of the risk for a core melt. So in concluding, I'd just reiterate what I said at the beginning. War in regions where there are nuclear reactors raise the dangers to almost unimaginable heights. All of this, in my view, strengthens the argument to permanently close and dismantle the world's nuclear power plants as soon as possible. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Linda, for your brilliant presentation. And we are now having questions. And I think there are 3 questions to you. The first one is, why are power plants dependent on the electrical grid when they are the power source? Would you please answer this question?
Well, they generate electricity, but they don't generate it for their own facility. So they are reliant on incoming power from the grid to conduct their operations, to boil water, fundamentally, to split the atom to boil water, to make steam, to turn the turbine, to create electricity. They do have on-site backup power, which is what I referred to briefly. And these are often diesel generators, which is what we saw in Fukushima, for example, which was not the cause of that tragedy. It was a result of it. When the earthquake happened, it disabled the off-site power, so they lost off-site power. When the tsunami hit, that took out the on-site power because the diesel generators were actually stored below grade, and so they were flooded. And so then you go to the last resort, which is battery backup, which is why you saw some of those workers rushing out into the parking lot and taking batteries out of cars. That's desperation. So that didn't work. So that's the cascade of problems that happen as soon as you lose off-site power.
We also have a command from Richard Andrews to post the references and citations made by you for future reference. And
I do have those. And you, so I was meant to say I would post those, and you want me to post those in the chat, I believe, although nobody can chat in the chat, they can see the links, correct?
I think maybe it's going to be possible to send it with the link to the recording.
Okay, I will put those in the chat, or maybe in an answer to one of the questions, and then they'll happen.
We have several questions about the recording, and as far as I know, within a couple of days, you all are going to get the link to the recording. And we also have a question from Lars Polmeyer before inviting Ira to speak. Are US companies involved in the Ukraine nuclear industry or West European? That's the question to you.
My understanding is that although the reactors they have right now, all the Russian VVER reactors, there was a contract made with Westinghouse for an AP1000 reactor, but I don't think that it has progressed very far. So at the moment, there's nothing under construction there, but there definitely are, there are opportunities there for marketing American designs to other countries, including Ukraine.
So we have a number of questions unanswered, but we need to move on with our speakers. So if we have enough time, I think we're going to do a sort of a discussion in the end, and I believe that everyone is going to get the answer to their question. And now I'm so pleased to invite Ira Helfand, who is the immediate past president of IPPNW and the co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is the US affiliate of the IPPNW. And Ira is going to talk today about the escalation to nuclear weapons. And Ira, please, the floor is yours. Ira, you are muted. Could you please unmute yourself? I'm sorry.
That would be helpful.
Yes.
Thank you, Olga. And thank you all for attending this briefing this morning. Barry and Linda have just described eloquently the catastrophic humanitarian impact that would result from a conventional war in Ukraine. But as the military exercises being carried out today involving nuclear capable forces make clear, this is fundamentally a conflict between two power blocs, Russia and NATO, which are armed with enormous numbers of nuclear weapons. And so we need to consider the possibility that this conflict could escalate to a nuclear war, as unimaginable as that is to all of us. It is quite unlikely that either side would deliberately choose to engage with nuclear weapons initially, But it is important for us to understand that both sides in this potential conflict have military policies which envision and expect the use of battlefield nuclear weapons if they are necessary to avoid a defeat in a conventional war. And so it is conceivable that a battlefield nuclear weapon could be introduced into the picture. And the problem is that once even a single battlefield nuclear weapon is used, it is impossible to predict what would happen next. But there is every reason to believe that the situation would escalate to a more widespread use of nuclear weapons. That is in fact what has happened in most of the tabletop war game exercises that were conducted, at least on the NATO side, during the nuclear weapons era. We have enormous difficulty imagining what nuclear war would look like. We have the images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and these are very powerful warnings to us of the power of these weapons, but we have to understand that a modern nuclear war between the United States, NATO on the one side, Russia on the other, would be totally different than what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each of those cities was attacked with one bomb of about 15 to 20 kilotons. In a modern war, cities would be attacked with many weapons, and they would be much larger. The warheads on Russian SS-18 missiles are anywhere from 25 to 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The weapons carried by US Trident submarines are 30 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either side, but it is widely believed that major cities like Moscow, New York, or Washington, London, Paris, would be targeted with 5, 10, 15, perhaps more nuclear warheads. Again, each in the range of perhaps 25 to 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And this is something which we have great difficulty conceiving or imagining. We have used a model historically of a single 20 megaton explosion, which happens to very accurately reflect the damage that would be done by 10 500 kiloton weapons of the sort that are on SS-18 and Trident submarine missiles. And so let me describe that to you very briefly. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this weapon, a fireball would form reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this area, the temperatures would reach the same level as the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. Buildings, trees, people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of this magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, wood, plastic, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across. Within this entire area, temperatures would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, 800 degrees Celsius. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of a city like New York, we are talking about anywhere from 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And this level of destruction would be visited on every major city in the United States, in Russia, much of Canada, much of Europe. A study that we published in 2002 showed that if just 300 of the warheads mounted on SS-18 missiles got through to urban targets in the United States, something between 75 and 100 million people would die in the first half hour. The same level of destruction would occur in Russia from a US attack. And not only would these large numbers of people be killed instantly, but the entire infrastructure on which population depends would be destroyed. The internet, the electric grid, the food distribution system, the public health system, the banking system, all of it would be gone. And over the months that followed this initial attack, the vast majority of the surviving population in both the United States and Russia, and in much of Europe, would also die from radiation exposure, from epidemic disease, from hunger, starvation, and from exposure. But these are just the direct effects of these weapons. There's also an enormous climate impact which must be understood. A large-scale war between NATO and Russia, using all of the weapons currently deployed, could put up to 150 million tons of soot into the atmosphere, according to studies carried out over the last 2 decades by Brian Toon and Alan Robach and their colleagues. This would block out the sun and drop temperatures across the entire planet up to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Within the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, it would be even colder. Temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen temperatures on this planet that cold since the coldest moment of the last ice age. And under these conditions, all of the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of that ice age would collapse. Food production would stop. The vast majority of the human race would starve to death. Even a much smaller nuclear war between NATO and Russia could cause severe climate disruption. As few as 400 or 500 warheads would cause enough cooling to disrupt agriculture across the globe and cause a dramatic decline in food available to people, a global famine, and an event that would kill hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, and end civilization as we know it. Now, we have to understand that as the great powers play out their game of chicken today over Ukraine, this is what is at stake. And we need to have a fundamental change in the way nations are conducting themselves. A war in Ukraine is absolutely intolerable, and we must take whatever steps we can to prevent that. IPPNW is circulating an appeal that was drafted by our European affiliates and which can be found on our website, ippnw.org, to the leaders of all countries involved in this conflict, calling on them to find a diplomatic, peaceful solution to this crisis. And I urge you all to visit the website and sign that appeal. And I think we have to understand that we have a limited ability to affect events in the current crisis. Events are moving too quickly, and we don't have adequate leverage. But what we can undertake and must undertake is an effort to make sure that if we are lucky enough to survive the current moment, we are never in this situation again. The nations of the world must come up with a different paradigm for relating to each other. This idea that great powers compete to see who ends up on top of the heap is just not acceptable in the modern world. It's possible one country or another may end up king of the mountain, but the mountain that they sit on top may be a radioactive ash pile. We have to deal with the climate crisis. We have to prepare for the next pandemic. We have to address the ongoing problems of economic and racial inequality and injustice. And we can only do that by adopting a cooperative approach in international relationships. Most important, we need to eliminate nuclear weapons once and for all. We cannot afford to have this incredible threat hanging over all of humanity. And the good news is that is something that we can do. And we can do it relatively easily. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. They do not require a major restructuring of human civilization as addressing the climate crisis does. It would be a relatively simple thing if the nations of the world made the decision to eliminate their nuclear weapons, to in fact eliminate them. And that is what we must work for. I generally have approached this issue with a great amount of hope, especially since the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was signed and entered into force in January of last year. I think at this moment, we are all having a lot of difficulty balancing the hope with the horror, to reference Barry's upcoming book. But again, if we are able to get past this current moment, we must dedicate ourselves with increased energy and determination to eliminating these weapons once and for all, so that all of the human family can move forward to address the other problems that we face and provide a safe environment where our children and our grandchildren and our descendants beyond that can live and prosper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ira. And we have a lot of questions, and I think that maybe we're going to start with the questions addressed to you, and afterwards move to Dr. Levy and Linda, and so that we can stay within 1 hour as it was promised. And we have the question about how many nuclear weapons are currently having in the United States, NATO, and Russia. Does anyone know the real number? I'm not sure.
Well, there are estimates of the number. The United States and Russia each have about 6,000 warheads total. Their deployed nuclear forces are about 1,500 warheads each. The French have about 240 additional deployed nuclear warheads, and the UK has about 120 deployed nuclear warheads. So we're talking about over 3,000 warheads that are deployed and ready to be used.
And we also have the question, what is the role of WHO if the nuclear war starts?
I think the WHO and the medical community in general would have a very limited role once nuclear war starts. It has been the message of the medical community and of the International Committee of the Red Cross for decades that there is no medical response really possible to nuclear war, which is why the emphasis has always been within the medical community so much on the need for prevention. And that is clearly true today as well.
We also have a quick remark and a question from Arun Mitra, who is telling us that the impact of this may not remain limited to Europe alone, and other countries are likely to be involved, of course. And in that scenario, the low-income countries will have serious adverse effects and could be long-lasting on economy. So the question from Arun is your take on this.
I think Arun is exactly right. In the event of a nuclear conflict, the consequences will be global, clearly. The climate effect will be global. Radiation effects will be spread far beyond the conflict zone. Even, I think, in the event of a conventional conflict, though, the disruption to world economy is going to have impacts everywhere across the globe. We are a very interconnected society at this point. And Barry and Linda may want to comment on that further.
No, I've nothing further.
Ira, we also have the question, can you say more about how the use of a single small nuclear weapon by either side would lead to all-out nuclear conflict?
Yeah, I mean, the concern is that a nuclear weapon would be used on the battlefield because one side or the other felt that it was losing and that it could not tolerate a conventional defeat. The problem is that that dynamic is still in play after that first nuclear weapon is used. If they are still losing, they might need to use more nuclear weapons. If the balance shifts and the other side feels that they are losing, the other side might use nuclear weapons. There have been many war games carried out by the United States and NATO over the years that I'm somewhat familiar with. Most of these have shown that if even a single nuclear weapon are used, that kind of escalatory spiral takes place and the situation degenerates into a large-scale nuclear conflict.
Although we have a lot of questions that have not been addressed personally, as I asked in the beginning, I think that's going to be the last question for now to you. Are the healthcare workers in Europe and the US prepared well for the nuclear war?
There has been almost no preparation ever attempted to deal with nuclear war. And again, as I mentioned a minute ago, the consensus amongst public health officials in the medical community and in the Red Cross is that no preparation really is possible. This is a situation that would simply overwhelm any plans that could possibly be put in place.
Thank you, Ira, so much. I'm not going to torture you for a moment with the questions because we also have a lot of questions for Barry and Dr. Levy. Could you please answer what are impacts of depleted uranium in weapons for short and long-term health?
Talk about depleted uranium. Yes. Well, there's a lot of concern about depleted uranium, which has been was used for many years to harden shells. And there's a great deal of contamination in Iraq from the Iraq War of depleted uranium. We don't have definitive answers. There's a great deal of concern. There are some studies that show that depleted uranium may increase cancer rates, that may have the potential to increase birth defects and other chronic disease problems. And at the same time, the studies that have been done have shown mixed results. As you might imagine, it's difficult to do what amounts to an ecological study looking at the relationship between radiation exposure, ionizing radiation exposure from depleted uranium and health effects, which may occur many, many years later. Populations move and so forth. So the final answer is not in, but depleted uranium remains an area of great concern.
Thank you, Barry. And we also have the question from Sergei Kolesnikov. Do you have information the so-called independent territories of Ukraine announced emergent evacuation of 700,000 civilians from the zone of possible action of Ukrainian army?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
So, whether you have information about the independent territories of Ukraine who announced the evacuation of 700,000 civilians from the zone of possible action of Ukrainian army.
I don't have specific information on that, but as I spoke briefly about in my talk, once populations are displaced, it's almost as if their infrastructure is destroyed, damaged. And so, people are suddenly uprooted from their homes, from their communities, from their support systems, from their healthcare, from food and water and so forth, with nowhere to go, and in the midst of a war. So it's a very dangerous situation when people are uprooted. And indeed, if war happens in Ukraine, many people will be uprooted suddenly. And it can be a real, very serious humanitarian crisis.
We have two more questions to you that been here for a couple, half an hour. So I think it's good to answer to them as people are waiting. And after that, we're going to maybe ask Linda to ask the many questions that we get. So Dr. Levy, with the war in Eastern Ukraine already going on since 2014, has anyone had a chance to look at the health impacts on the over 1 million refugees who have already fled over the past 8 years, as well as the causes of death of the 14,000 people who have already died over the past 8 years?
The short answer to the question is I don't know. I would hope that some people have systematically looked at that. These are difficult issues to study, and even prospectively. And so I don't know. It's something I'll look into, but it's a very important question.
And the last question addressed to you personally is the EU NATO forewarning us of war maybe within 24 hours, or US agencies?
And again, I'm not sure exactly the question about a warning within 24 hours. Again.
Yeah, I think you are being asked by anonymous attendee whether there is any information warning us of the war that could be happening within 24 hours, but it's addressed to you personally.
Yeah. So again, this is a military question. The short answer is I don't know. Some people have hypothesized, and it's merely a hypothesis or a theory, that Russia is reluctant to actually start a full-scale invasion while the Olympics are still going on. By this time tomorrow, I believe the Olympics will be over. But we don't know. We don't know when a full-scale invasion will occur, even if a full-scale invasion, whether a standoff like this with a lower intensity of fighting may go on for some period of time. The short answer is we don't know.
Thank you, Barry. And we also have the question that was addressed to everyone. So Moving from you to Linda, maybe I'm going to ask both of you this question. Do we agree that we Americans as a people and nation have the power to prevent wars, including a war in the Ukraine? What are the health consequences to Americans living in the United States for a war in the Ukraine? In such situations, why and how are the mental health of Americans affected that might cause us physical harm from fear or our conscience in being responsible and lives lost? How much do we Americans care about the physical and mental health of people, especially when they are not American lives? And what will the Americans do to prevent war? So those are the questions to everyone. So Linda, I'm going to be really happy if you're going to answer after Barry. Thanks.
Well, I really defer to Ira or Linda addressing that first, and I'll be happy to add. But I'd be happy to hear what Linda or Ira might have to say about that, and I'll be happy to add something.
I think I'm going to let Ira, not to keep punting this, but I'm not a doctor. So I don't really feel qualified to speculate on those kind of large questions about the American people as a whole. But I'm curious to know from a medical point of view, what your thoughts are.
Well, I also have some difficulty with the question, but I think a couple of things that can be said. One is that the direct health effects on people living in the United States from a conventional war in Ukraine would be limited. The effects on the health of people in the United States, if this war escalates to nuclear war, will be catastrophic, as they will be for everybody across the planet. Whether the degree to which people in the United States are concerned with possible conflict thousands of miles away, I think that's very hard to know. I think this has been followed very closely by the American public, but it's hard to know how large this looms in people's minds. And I think that's true not just of people in the United States, but people everywhere on the planet who are not directly in the potential conflict zone.
Yeah, I have nothing. I have nothing to add to that. I'd rather have Linda have an opportunity to answer the questions that are posed directly. I totally agree though with what Ira just said.
Thank you. And we have a number of questions to Linda, and the one by Jean Turcot, who is asking about what happens if the plants become unmanned and about the air quality outside the radioactive particles.
Well, I think I talked a little bit about, what happens if they become unmanned. I mean, they really can't be. I mean, that's the problem. As I said, even on a normal day, you can't just walk away from a nuclear power plant. But obviously, in a war zone, the temptation's there. And actually, we do have a little bit of a preview glimpse of this from the Fukushima situation, because when that was unfolding, TEPCO actually wanted to evacuate the workforce. And Nato, who was the prime minister at the time and has now become a very outspoken advocate for an end to the use of nuclear power, got on the phone and said, you can't do this, because if that workforce had evacuated, those reactors would have gone into major meltdown, released their inventories of radioactivities. And there was just a few kilometers down the road, another nuclear power plant, Fukushima Daini, which would have meant that those workers would have had to abandon operating reactors. And this cascade of meltdowns would have eventuated in the necessity to evacuate Tokyo. And what Khan said about that was that would have been the end of Japan as a nation if we'd had to do that. So he could sort of foresee the necessity of this sacrifice that had to be made by a skeleton crew in shifts at Fukushima to keep things under control. Similarly at Chernobyl. So it's just unfortunately not an option. And it's such a drastic thing to have to ask of people. That's why I keep making my little plug for an end to the use of this, because it's a sort of small scale nuclear war in a way, not nearly as bad, obviously, as the scenarios that Ira described, but nevertheless, once you release that kind of radioactivity, what does it do to the health situation? Well, I did put in the Q&A in the answer to the question about the links to those reports about Chernobyl. And that's a far, it was a major release of radioactivity, hugely widespread health effects, but we're talking about orders of magnitude worse situation now with much older reactors with far larger radioactive inventories. So it would be catastrophic, obviously, for health.
Thank you, Linda. We're running short of time, but still we have some more questions to answer. And maybe you could answer at the same time to two questions that we have. One is, what do you say to environmentalists who support nuclear energy as a sort of clean energy solution? I think that's a big debate always. And how hard are reactor containers in the face of a direct conventional artillery or missile attack? I think we can repeat them.
Well, that first question doesn't really speak directly to the issue at hand today. Obviously, Ukraine is a whole nother debate. But in a nutshell, if you support nuclear power, you're not an environmentalist. I mean, that's, that would be my thesis, because nuclear power requires a major extractive industry of uranium. It contaminates lands, people, health, soil, water, air, all along the fuel chain. It is not renewable. And as far as an answer to climate change, far too expensive, far too slow, and far too dangerous. Keeping current reactors open steals funding from renewables, which could do the job faster. You get more reduction of carbon per dollar per hour with renewables than you do for nuclear power. So you're just wasting time and money pouring it into old reactors. New reactors are still, what we call PowerPoint reactors on paper. You could never bring them on in enough numbers in time to reduce the kind of carbon that you need to reduce. So the whole thing is a big lobbying exercise and a distraction from the real necessity at hand. And I would say the other thing in the context of what we're talking about today is there's a clear link between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And so as long as you perpetuate the existence of nuclear power plants, you are exporting them. That's what they want to do with the small modular reactors, export them probably to Saudi Arabia, giving Saudi Arabia the chance to progress to a nuclear arms production. So all these things are closely connected. And so that's my nutshell answer to the first question. I'm sorry I didn't catch the second one, but maybe I can answer it in a text, and we'll go to somebody else now for a minute.
Yeah, and we also have the question, maybe what percentage of Ukraine power comes from the nuclear?
Sorry, what percentage of the electricity comes from the nuclear sector? Yeah, about 50, about half of it.
We also have a big command and important from Vapu Taipale from Finland, and I would like to read it to everyone that Vapu has good beloved friends both in Russia and Ukraine, and have visited the IPPN Global Campaign, the hospital in Moscow where the workers of Chernobyl were treated. And he was born in 1940 in the middle of Second World War, lost his father, remembering the bomb shelters and food rationing. And Vapu tells us that we have to convince the world that the war is always a great catastrophe, and especially now when the environment, poverty, and hunger need our attention and money. And I think we are now running out of time, and I'm really sorry that we couldn't answer all the questions, but we did answer to 42 questions, and I think that's a huge productivity for the three speakers that we have. And I think that's quite a question to the central office. Can you provide emails of speakers so we can ask them any question not answered this morning? And maybe we can have the answer in the chat, because unfortunately I don't know what to say. That maybe we can send it along with the recording to all the people who would like to have their answers. Yes, I was told that we can send you the emails of all the speakers so you can stay in touch with them and have all the answers. So now we would like to thank all the presenters and participants for joining us today, especially those who live closer to the border of the possible conflict that we've been discussing today. As of course that could have much more impact, and that was already told today, that when we're living closer to the border, it's much more catastrophic and dangerous than living on other continents. But of course, the nuclear threat is a danger that could touch every single person on our planet, and we must remember about that. And we all believe that the future lies in cooperation, empathy, and common work. And I think today our briefing is the brilliant example of that. And as you know, the COVID pandemic has shown us how it's important to stay all together in that and in tough times, and how people need to be together to support each other. to have the opportunity to hold the hand to each other, to hug and support one another. And as Ira has already said, and I would like to support and stress out this information that the European affiliate, together with Lars Polmeyer and Sergei Kolesnikov, have worked hard to prepare the appeal where medical professionals call for diplomacy to avert a humanitarian disaster. And the link is provided to you in the chat. And I believe we can include the link in the email that you're going to receive together with the recording and with the emails of our brilliant speakers. So the European affiliate, as far as I know from this morning, plans to send this appeal to the heads of states, and we need much more signatures. So this morning it was 570 signatures, and we need much more support from those of you who'd like to support this important work for the peace and world free of violence and nuclear threat. And the appeal is already translated to German, Greek, Italian, and Norwegian. And as far as I know, the Russian translation is almost ready. And would like to thank Professor Sergei Kolesnikov for this immense and great work. And our responsibility is to give our children and those who are coming after us, our younger doctors and students, the best world that we can, and a safe and happy world. And this weekend, the IPPN students chapter are organizing the event to support the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I believe that we have the link to this initiative in the chat as well, the bike for the ban. And I would like to thank everyone for this great work for peace. And if anyone has anything to add, I would be happy to hear from you, any of the speakers. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and stay in touch via email. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.